The first time I realized love could echo in two different voices, it was coming from the same mouth. It was a Tuesday night in June, sticky heat clinging to our curtains, and the fan in the hallway ticked like a slow clock with asthma. I was rinsing basil under the tap, our small ritual for Tuesday pasta, when my husband slipped behind me and whispered, "Hey, June bug," in that gravel-soft tone I always teased him about. Only fort. The voice carried a tilt, an edge of someone rushing a line they'd practiced. The basil stem snapped in my hand. It was such a tiny thing, just sound, but the pieces of my world would later fall along that crack like beads on a cut string. I set the basil down and turned to look at him. The kitchen light carved his face into warmth and shadow, same slicked hair, same almond eyes that smiled before his mouth did, the familiar pale scar across his right eyebrow. He kissed my forehead and reached for the pot. Humming, "Ain't No Mountain High Enough," off-key his habit. It fit. Everything fit. And yet the voice kept ringing in my ears like a double bell. Close enough. Not quite. "Long day?" he asked, stealing a slice of tomato. He always stole the ugly ones first. Said the pretty ones were for the plate. "Mm-hmm," I said, studying his hands. "Same hands. You sound different." "And?" He laughed. "It's the fan. You know, it makes everyone sound like a voicemail. It is Graps." We ate. We talked bills. We argued lightly about whether the basil plant would survive my black thumb, and he accused me playfully of plant cruelty. His phone buzzed twice on the table, face down. He ignored it. When I stepped outside to shake the crumbs from the tablecloth, I caught his reflection in the window, head bent toward the screen, smile pressed flat like he'd ironed it on. My skin prickled. And then I told myself what wives tell themselves. When small things feel big, let it go. You're tired. You love him. By the time dishes were stacked and the fan had coughed itself into stillness, the night felt ordinary again. The voice in my ear receded. He fell asleep quickly. One arm flung over his face like a curtain. I lay awake, listening to the old house hum. In the faint streetlight, I could see the collage of photographs we'd taped to the closet door, wedding day confetti caught in my lashes, our hands holding plastic forks over a cheap motel, bedspread on our honeymoon road trip. His mother, my mother-in-law, smiling in a church pew, pearls tight against her throat, twin sons flanking her like bookends. You should know, my husband, Daniel, has a twin. Ethan. The first time I saw them together, I could swear the air around them doubled two men. Same outline. Moving like mirrors. If you don't know twins like that, you don't know how easily your brain relaxes into trusting one for the other. Before the drama, life was a little ceramic bowl. Cracks hidden but holding. We lived in a narrow brick townhouse that leaned toward the street like it was always about to gossip. The kitchen window faced a maple that shed enough leaves to make every autumn feel like a holiday. In summer, we kept a pitcher of iced tea sweating on the counter. In winter, I tucked cinnamon sticks into the sugar jar and called it cozy. We played card games and fought over rules we both forgot. We shared a calendar app like trained adults, and we kissed on red lights because it made us feel like teenagers. I worked at the library 2 blocks over, a low building that smelled like paper and dusted lemon oil. I loved the way people softened their voices at the threshold, as if books were sleeping babies. My job was to put things in order, spines straight, records neat, and recommend mysteries to people who felt alone. Dan worked in residential construction with Ethan. A small company. The family had started when the brothers were 19, and everybody told them it would never last. They wore boots that tracked the world into our house and shirts with the logo stitched crooked over the heart. Every evening, he came home with sawdust in his hair. I picked it out with my fingers, like a mother bird. Sundays belonged to his mother. Family supper, she called it, which meant roast chicken on the good dishes, extra napkins folded like boats, the twins seated across from each other like a photograph. She wore control like perfume, powdery, almost sweet. She was the kind of woman who smoothed the air as she walked through it, who corrected the angle of a picture frame before she hugged you. June, she'd say, calling me by my birth month and my name, which happened to be the same. Pass the carrots. Sweet girl. And then, to the twins, only half joking, I gave you life. Do not waste it. It's Pound. Her house had a way of making me sit up straighter. The couch cushions never lost a battle. The silverware drawer sang when you pulled it out. She kept the wedding portrait of the twins' father, gone a decade now, on a piano no one played. Sometimes I'd catch her fingers hovering over the keys, like she wanted to press down, make a sound, and thought better of it. Once, in those easy days, I watched Dan and Ethan build a fence together in our small backyard. From the kitchen sink, their shadows lined the grass like a single man working twice. Sweat made their t-shirts cling identical. Their laughter looped in the same places. They blended. I remember feeling grateful for it, this sense that my husband had a second pair of hands in the world, as if God had looked at his life and said, "Let there be help." But love is not a mirror. When it reflects too perfectly, you start to wonder what's missing behind the glass. The first difference I learned between them was a preference. Dan took his coffee black. Ethan drowned his in cream. The second was a habit. Dan sang off-key shamelessly. Ethan lip-synced and made jokes about it. The third was a telling. When I teased Dan about his off-key voice, he pulled me in, let the joke land on him and bounce, then kissed the crown of my head. When I teased Ethan, his smile tightened just before it widened, a rubber band snapping silently in the middle. "Y'all are like a sitcom," I told their mother once, watching the twins bicker over who forgot to bring the level to a job. She smiled without showing teeth. "They keep me young," she said, and patted my hand as if we shared the same secret. Our wedding was small. We married in a whitewashed church with wooden pews that still carried the varnish scent of every child who had been told to sit still. The twins wore gray suits. Their mother wore navy. When the pastor said, "You may kiss your bride," Dan's hands trembled against my cheeks, and the kiss tasted like a promise kept. After, Ethan hugged me so hard my bones answered back. "Welcome," he said. "You're one of us now. A discoms of comstive climb." I wanted to believe that meant safety. I wanted to believe one of us meant I could put my trust on the table and no one would pocket it like a tip. The night of the strange voice, I slept badly, woke early, and found Dan already dressed, boots laced, coffee steaming. "Ethan needs me," he said. "There's an inspection in Greenfield." He was halfway out the door when he doubled back to kiss my cheek. "I'll call you after lunch." Enid. Instead, a text. "Inspection moved. Might be late. Love you." The words were familiar as my own reflection. Still, they landed with that same off-tilt feeling. A picture frame hung a breath to the left. I shook it off. At the library, I shelved a whole cart of biographies that smelled like old closets. I answered a morose teenager's question about overdue fines like I was negotiating a hostage situation. I let my mind quiet. I let the day be the day. At 4, I stepped into the staff room and found a bouquet of peonies on the table, fat and blushing, my favorite. The card read, "For June, who deserves softness." D. My coworkers cooed. I smiled, heat pricking my eyes until I looked at the pen strokes. Dan prints his lowercase d like a tiny looped lasso. Learned from a first-grade teacher who used to tap his knuckles. The D on the card sat straight like a little soldier. I heard, faintly, the echo of that strange Tuesday night voice. It's nothing, I told myself. People can write neat when they try. People can sound different when they're tired. The fan changes everything. The fan changes nothing. On the way home, I called Dan. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. His voice earnest and familiar. Leave it after the beep. June bug. I listened to the tone, the cadence, memorized the way the June lingered. I hung up, turned on the radio, and drove past our street like I didn't. In the next neighborhood over, I circled a cul-de-sac lined with maples that were not ours and watched a father teach his daughter to ride a bike. She wobbled. He ran beside her, his hand a bracket at her back. I wanted my life to feel like that hand, steady, obvious. There. When I finally pulled into our driveway, dusk had dropped over the maple like a shawl. Dan's truck sat crooked, one tire biting the grass, his signature parking, when he rushed in with a call still in his ear. Inside, the house held its breath. A glass ring sweat into the coffee table. A tool belt drooped against the couch like a sleeping animal. The basil plant leaned toward the window. Thirsty. I watered it. I set the peonies in a jar and stood back, waiting for my heart to settle. It didn't. It was a tiny thing, that first crack. A voice shaded just a little to the left. A letter drawn too straight. But if you've ever lived in an old house, you know, the smallest fissure invites the weather in. I wish I could tell you I ran to the truth and snatched it by the throat. I didn't. I did what women do when the floor shifts under the rug. We pour tea into 2 cups, sit with our fear like a guest, and say, "Tell me your name." My fear said, "Listen closer." The following Sunday at my mother-in-law's house, the world looked polished again, like someone had scrubbed away every shadow. She'd made her famous pot roast, the one that filled every corner with the smell of rosemary and onion. The twins sat across from each other as always, the same smirk flickering between them. And for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything. Then Ethan said, "June, how's the basil holding up?" End quote. The fork slipped from my hand. The basil. End quote. He smiled. "Yeah, from Tuesday's pasta night." I know. My gaze darted to Dan. He was pouring wine, face unreadable. "How do you know about that?" I asked lightly, careful not to sound defensive. Ethan's eyes flickered. "Oh," he told me. "Right. You said something about killing plants. Actional tan was." Dan chuckled too quickly. "Yeah," I told him. "I said you were trying to save another victim." End quote. His mother clucked her tongue. "Oblivious or pretending? I told you both. She's a keeper. A woman who worries over herbs will worry over you." Clear lows. Everyone laughed. I smiled, but it hurt the inside of my mouth. Because Dan didn't tell Ethan. I knew he didn't. We hadn't spoken about Tuesday except to joke about the fan. It was a tiny thing, but tiny things start the avalanche. After dinner, while the men loaded dishes, I offered to pack leftovers. In the kitchen, the air smelled like dish soap and roasted carrots. My mother-in-law, Marion, leaned close to whisper, "You're good for him, June. You bring calm into the family. Take Stan." "Thank you," I said, though it felt like a statement that required proof. She smiled, smoothing my hair back with fingertips too cool. "It's rare these days women who know how to keep things balanced." End quote. Balanced. Today. Her eyes, a sharp gray like polished steel, didn't blink. Men are complicated when they share so much. You have to love them both, in your own way. It's kind, Andreas. I didn't know how to answer that. Before I could, Ethan came back for the dessert tray. Marion's smile turned syrupy. Go easy on the pie, darling, she said. June baked it herself. I have the clear with men. He winked. I always go easy on June. I had. The words were harmless on paper. Spoken aloud, they wrapped around me like vines. Dan didn't react, just kept rinsing plates, water running steady as if he couldn't hear. That night, on the drive home, silence stretched between us. Streetlights passed over his face in stripes. I wanted to ask why his mother said, love them both. I wanted to ask why his brother knew what we ate on Tuesday. Instead, I said, you parked crooked again. It's a mater. He laughed softly. You sound like my mom. And quote. Maybe she's rubbing off. I have grade presses. He reached for my hand on the console. His fingers were warm. The warmth didn't reach my chest. We went to bed without the usual teasing. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the shadows forming twin shapes that shifted when I blinked. In the following weeks, little moments began to repeat themselves like a song skipping. One morning, Dan's phone buzzed while he was in the shower. I didn't snoop. I only glanced. The message preview read, Still thinking about that night, E. I froze. E could mean Ethan. It could mean anyone. The screen locked before I could see more. My heart hammered like I'd sprinted across the room, though I hadn't moved an inch. When Dan came out, towel slung low, steam haloing his shoulders, I asked, casual as breath, Hey, who's E? Axteress. He paused just long enough for my stomach to drop. Then, E. Probably Ethan. We're planning a project bid together. Why? End quote. I smiled. Just curious. It is very 14x'd. He kissed my cheek, water dripping down his jaw. You're funny, he said, like that solved everything. But later that night, when I saw him typing on his phone in the dark, the blue glow painting his face, I wondered why a project bid needed to be discussed at midnight. A week later, Marion called. Can you come by? Dear, I've been feeling lonely. I'm Maprit. I brought her lemon bread and stayed for tea. The house looked museum perfect as always, not a speck of dust out of place. She poured 2 cups, her movements rehearsed, her pearls catching the light. I'm glad you came, she said, stirring sugar into her cup, though she never used sugar. I've been meaning to ask, how are you adjusting? Marriage to a twin can be confusing. It's now Kennedy. I laughed, trying to read her tone. I manage. They're different enough. It's sand and weather where grade with a distibalus. Her lips curved slightly. Different, yes, but not always when it matters. When we know going sign. She sipped her tea, eyes fixed on me over the rim of the cup. Tell me, June, if one of them made a mistake. Would you know which one? Axes. The question hit me like a pebble dropped down a well small, echoing forever. I think I would, I said, unsure. Marion smiled, almost fond. I used to think so too. End quote. She changed the subject before I could ask what she meant. But when I left, I saw something on the mantel I hadn't noticed before, a framed photo of me and Dan at our wedding. Only the reflection of the glass caught Ethan standing just behind, blurred, watching. That night I dreamed of 2 hands holding mine's same grip, same warmth, and I couldn't tell which belonged to my husband. The real crack came at a charity event for the company. Marion had organized it. Of course, family presentation, she called it, meaning the twins would speak and I'd stand beside them like the proper wife. I wore the navy dress, Dan said. He loved the one with the soft neckline. When we arrived, Ethan greeted me first. "You look beautiful, June," he said, his voice low, too familiar. Just like old times. When 4-4 prized 4-4-4. Old times. Before I could ask, Marion appeared, ushering him toward the stage. Dan brushed my shoulder with his hand, the gesture quick and almost apologetic. During the speeches, I stood near the back, clapping in all the right places, smiling when cameras turned. But when Ethan spoke, he used phrases only Dan ever said to me, private things. My anchor, my calm in the storm. My chest tightened. Afterward, a young secretary from the office approached me, bubbly with wine. "It's so sweet how close they are," she said. "But honestly, if I didn't know, I'd swear it was Ethan you dated first, not Dan." 10 spadios. I blinked. "What?" "Einfind." "Oh, I just mean you and Ethan seemed, I don't know, familiar at the last holiday party." She giggled, waved her hand. "Forget I said that. Don't forget today, splash now, water in a, quote." But I couldn't forget. On the drive home, I replayed every detail: the bouquet, the text from E, the slip at dinner, the things his mother said, and the voice, the one that sounded almost like my husband but wasn't. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I was trembling. "Are you cold?" Dan asked. "No," I said. "Just tired." "Actually differentness." He nodded, kissed my forehead. "You worry too much. June bug. Very province." He walked inside, leaving me under the porch light, where moths battered themselves against the bulb. I stood there until the cold found my bones. Because for the first time since I said, "I do," I wasn't sure which twin I'd actually married. The next morning, I called the library and said I was sick. I wasn't. I drove to Marion's house instead, arriving unannounced. She opened the door in a silk robe, perfectly composed. "June," she said, surprised but not startled. "Is everything all right?" 2000 by line. "I just needed to ask, did you ever confuse them?" Dan and Ethan. "It's not aground." Her smile was thin as paper. "Every mother of twins does. But it's not confusion. Really, it's understanding." End quote. Understanding what? Ain't knowed. That two halves can make one whole. It's a disted. Something inside me went cold. "You mean..." She touched my arm. "You worry too much, dear. Just enjoy what you have. It's now the grow." That phrase. The same one Dan used the night before. I left before she could see my hands shaking. And as I drove home, my mind replayed that first night, the strange voice, the wrong D on the card, the way Ethan said Junebug once when he thought I couldn't hear. It wasn't imagination. It was a pattern. And patterns, I've learned, are just secrets repeating until someone listens. When the truth finally came, it didn't knock. It broke the door open and stood there, smiling. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to answer. Dan had left his phone on the kitchen counter, screen buzzing across the marble. He was in the shower again. I didn't mean to look, I swear. But when your chest already holds the suspicion like a live coal, even a whisper of smoke draws your eyes. The contact name said Project E. My hands hesitated, then slid the green icon. A man's voice, low, quiet, familiar in the worst way, said, "I can't stop thinking about her. She looked at me like she used to. End quote. Or graded 5 way. I couldn't breathe. Who is this? Castas Braddock. The pause on the other end was long enough for my pulse to count its own death. June. It's not great. Ethan's voice. He exhaled, a sound between surprise and pleasure. Dan's not supposed to answer that. It's Delavan one. Apparently, neither am I. I'm servantedid. He chuckled softly, the same tone I'd mistaken for affection so many months ago. Guess we both made a mistake. In 22-9, I hung up. My hands were trembling so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I wanted to storm into the bathroom, to scream, to demand, but instead, I stood there in the silence and let the hot air fill my lungs until I thought I'd choke. When Dan came out, towel slung across his shoulders, I was sitting at the table, the phone in front of me. He looked at it, then at me. Someone called, I said. My voice came out flat. Oh, it's not aglived. Ethan. End quote. You have anyway, this Tannelly. He froze for a fraction of a second. He probably needed. He said he can't stop thinking about her. Actually wantin' round. The towel slipped from his hand. What? Is boarded. You tell me, I whispered. Who's her? End quote. His mouth opened, then closed again. June. You're misunderstanding. Actually, Regner. I laughed. The sound was brittle, like glass underfoot. I'm misunderstanding that. Tell me. Daniel, when exactly did your brother start calling you from a number saved as Project E? I'm Pervid Stand. He rubbed his forehead. It's complicated. It's a now and now. Then simplify it. I have no braided. He looked away, jaw working, eyes darting toward the window as if the truth might be hiding outside. Before we got married, he said finally, voice thin. You met Ethan first. I mend. My stomach turned to ice. What? Thanks for watching. You met him at the coffee shop. Remember, he said his name was Dan. I have now a fort. I blinked, shaking my head. No, that was you. You wore the blue shirt, the one with the paint stain. That was his. Let's brawn it. For a moment, the world went utterly still. The sound of the dripping faucet, the hum of the fridge, all of it fell away. He went on, words tumbling now, desperate. He was helping me with the business back then. I was out of town for weeks, and he said he'd keep you company, so you wouldn't forget me. He didn't mean for it to go too far. Too far. My voice cracked. He dated me for 6 months. Together Ryams. It wasn't supposed to last. Mom said, your mother knew. Clay. He closed his eyes. She thought it would make things easier, that if you fell for one of us, you'd love the other the same way. And I couldn't speak. I felt like my bones had been replaced by smoke. Dan took a step closer. June, it was stupid. We thought we were protecting you. From what? The truth. It's not now. There is applied for the 22s of God. It's not for the plighted for the stand, where there is all the 5 He reached out, but I stepped back. My shoulder hit the counter. You married me, I said. You let me say vows. You let me believe it was you I loved from the beginning. You let me sleep beside you, thinking the memories were ours. They weren't. Inwoed. June, please, don't. My voice came out so calm it scared me. Don't say my name like it's still yours to use. I could langsting on the mainen. I walked past him. My reflection caught in the hallway, mirror pale face, trembling hands, the basil plant dying on the sill. Everything ordinary, everything shattered. that night. I didn't sleep. Every moment rewound itself, frame by frame. The first date. The first kiss. The first "I love you" whispered in that low, almost shy tone I thought was Dan's. It had been Ethan's voice all along. The realization cut through me in waves. Shame, disbelief, fury. And beneath it, something worse, grief. For the version of my life that no longer existed. By morning, I was shaking, but steady enough to act. I needed proof, something undeniable. Something that could stand when words twisted. So I went to the house I'd once thought of as family. Marion opened the door before I knocked twice. "June, dear. You look pale. It's some side." "I know," I said. "I'm here for the truth." Ask hardly. Her eyes flickered, but her smile didn't waver. "The truth is a slippery thing, sweetheart." Tannel served. I stepped inside anyway. The air smelled like lemon polish and secrets. "I know about Ethan," I said. "And I know you knew." Allo. Her shoulders relaxed, as if I'd confirmed something she'd been waiting for. "Then we don't have to pretend anymore." C's parted tuning the 60 abscess, and the way she said it made my stomach twist. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you let that happen?" "It's braided." She sighed, almost gently. "Because Daniel's always been the weaker one. Ethan takes care of him. Always has. I wanted to make sure he had a wife who could love both sides of the same soul. If we was." "That's not love," I said. "That's control." End quote. Marion tilted her head. "You think marriage is about purity. Dear, it's about endurance. About playing the cards you're given. You've been happy, haven't you?" At us. Happy. The word felt like mockery. "Does Ethan know you're saying this?" I asked. Her lips curved faintly. "Ethan does what I ask. He always has." "Dermond." She turned then, crossing to the sideboard, pulling open a drawer. "You shouldn't have come here. You'll only hurt yourself." End quote. I stepped closer. "What's in that drawer?" 18 Hine. She smiled without looking at me. "A collection of memories. You could call them insurance. The 5, with Ovid's Tadeusz." When she opened it, I saw a stack of small memory cards, neatly labeled with dates that matched my first months with Dan. With Ethan. "You recorded us." My voice broke. She closed the drawer softly. "Don't be dramatic. It was just a precaution. For everyone's protection." I could barely see straight. "You watched us." "And agree and acquiesced. I made sure my sons were safe," she said simply. "And so were you." Askly. Something in me snapped, then not the loud kind of breaking, but quiet. Decisive. The kind that doesn't heal wrong because it never heals at all. I backed away, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "You're sick," I said. Marion's expression didn't change. "I'm practical." End quote. I turned and left, the front door slamming behind me, sunlight burning my eyes. In the car, I sat, gripping the wheel, shaking. Every image blurred, the wedding, the laughter, the dinners. The way she'd said, "You have to love them both." It wasn't a metaphor. It was instruction. That evening, Ethan showed up at our door. His expression was half regret, half dare. "I guess he told you," he said. "Why did you do it?" I whispered. He leaned against the doorframe, eyes scanning my face. "Because I could. And because you loved me first." Quote, as a mudgist, the air between us cracked like lightning. No, I said. I loved a lie. They're Arvagetting and a Christed to the never one. He smiled faintly. Sometimes that's the same thing. If you asked. I slapped him before I knew I'd moved. The sound echoed through the doorway. Clean and final. He didn't flinch. You should leave, I said. He straightened his shirt. That same shirt from the coffee shop years ago. You'll tell him. If you all to everything. I have. He nodded. Then make sure you tell him this: he wouldn't have you if it weren't for me. It's gonna dated. He walked away, slow and unbothered. Like a man leaving a fire he'd started just to watch it burn. When the door clicked shut, I sank to the floor. The basil plant wilted in the window. The peonies long gone brown. The house smelled like dust and endings. And for the first time, I knew that love built on confusion wasn't love at all. It was a game I never agreed to play. There's a moment after devastation when the world turns eerily polite. The wind still blows. The refrigerator hums. Even your own heartbeat forgets to panic for a while. That's when I realized the only way to survive something like this is to stop waiting for apologies that will never come. I didn't scream. I didn't pack a bag and drive into the night like the movies tell you to. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and made tea. The spoon clinked against the mug, steady as a metronome. My hands needed a rhythm. My mind needed air. When Dan came home, the house smelled like chamomile and betrayal. He stopped at the doorway, his face drawn. June, we need to talk. Actively brave. I know, I said, but I'll start. End quote. He nodded warily, sitting opposite me. His eyes darted toward the window, toward anywhere but mine. I went to your mother's house. I began. She told me everything. About Ethan. About the recordings. About her little experiment. End quote. His breath hitched. She showed you. Yes. All of it. It's Cly's one. He pressed his palms over his face. God. Aided. I watched him. I didn't feel pity. Not yet. You let her do that. You let her manipulate me. R did. I didn't know about the recordings, he said quietly. I swear. June. She said she was just helping. It's now they're helping who? You. Ethan. Or herself. Accident. He didn't answer. The silence between us was so thick it felt alive. The only sound was the distant whir of the ceiling fan. I wondered if it would change his voice again if he spoke. I was in love with a ghost. Dan, I said finally. You let me live with that. You watched me tell stories about how we met, how our first date went, how I fell for your stupid grin. And you just let it happen. Adele did. He looked up, eyes wet. I thought if you found out, you'd leave. Rallying too hard. I laughed, low and sharp. You should have trusted me enough to give me that choice. It is presented, says. He reached across the table. I'll fix it. I, Zess. You can't. I would no injure. He flinched, and his hand fell back to his lap. For a long moment, we just sat there, two strangers, sharing a house full of borrowed memories. Then I stood. I'm not staying here tonight. June? Please. I shook my head. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting what's left of me. Aiding. I drove until the city lights thinned and the road widened into the kind of darkness that doesn't ask questions. I ended up at a motel off Route 12. The kind with flickering vacancy signs and vending machines that only took quarters. The clerk, a tired woman with hair the color of cigarette ash, slid me a key without a word. The room smelled of bleach and old curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried not loudly. but steadily, like rain seeping through a crack in the roof. At 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. Dan, I love you. Please don't give up on us. Then another, Mom's asking where you are. She's worried. Worried? That word stung. I pictured Marion in her perfect kitchen, sipping tea, pretending her world hadn't just collapsed. I turned off my phone. The next morning, I called the one person who never asked for explanations, my friend Claire from the library. She answered on the second ring, voice still groggy. June, are you okay? I have her. No, I said simply, but I need a favor. It's not as heated. By noon, I was back in town, sitting in the library's break room with Claire. I told her everything from the wrong voice on Tuesday night to the memory cards in the drawer. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she just said, "You need to make it public. Accessed." End quote. I don't want to humiliate them, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure that was true. She shook her head. This isn't revenge, June. It's proof. You've been made to feel crazy. You need to take the narrative back. Dated was now the pressed. I looked down at my hands. What would that even look like? Also, it is acquitted crasted. She reached into her bag and pulled out her laptop. We'll start by copying those recordings. Evidence doesn't lie. Browned grassed furs. I hesitated. I don't have them. They're at her house. End quote. Then you'll get them. If we don't, Reg. Her tone was calm, firm, the kind that lends you courage just by existing. That evening, I drove back to Marion's house. The sky was the color of steel wool, thunder pacing the distance. I parked at the curb, heart pounding so loud it drowned the rain beginning to fall. I didn't knock this time. I walked straight in. Marion stood in the living room, startled but composed. June, she said. I was just about to call. I'm noted. I'm not here to talk, I said. I'm here to take what's mine. End quote. Wanda's tale. Her brow arched. And what's that? With thank you for watching, its make fairy has tried, and every inch of stays. The truth. Actioned is common. I crossed to the sideboard and pulled open the drawer. The memory cards were still there. Neat and damning. I scooped them into my purse. Marion's voice sharpened. You have no right. I have every right. I turned to face her. You filmed me without consent. You lied to me. You treated my marriage like a puppet show. It is now due. Her lips thinned. Be careful, dear. Families can turn cruel when embarrassed. So can wives. And, for the first time, she faltered. Her eyes darted to the staircase, as if expecting Ethan or Dan to appear. But no one did. I walked to the door, pausing only once. You said I should love them both, I said. You forgot to tell me which one was human. It is. Then I left. At Claire's apartment that night, we watched the videos on her computer. The footage was grainy but clear enough, me laughing in a restaurant, Ethan's hand brushing mine across the table, his voice saying Junebug with that same practiced tilt. Each clip twisted my stomach tighter, but there was something liberating too. Proof. Finally. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't dramatic. I was deceived. We saved the files to a secure drive. Claire looked at me. What now? And, I'm going to show him, I said. Dan. It said, to affirmated anyway. All of them. It is Tam. The next Sunday, I arrived at family supper early. Marion opened the door. Expression unreadable. You came, she said softly. Yes, I said. And I brought something for dessert. Tignot, of course. Dan and Ethan were already at the table. Their conversation died when they saw me. I set a small projector on the sideboard and connected it to my drive. The screen glowed against the far wall. "What's this?" Ethan asked, feigning ease. "Storytime," I said. The first clip began to play. My own face, months younger, smiling. Ethan's voice saying, "You smell like basil and rain." Marion's faint laughter in the background. Dan's jaw tightened. "Turn it off," he said. "No," I whispered. "You wanted me to see the truth. Now you can watch it with me." He said, "Ira Dodd." For 3 minutes, the room filled with the sound of my past unraveling. When it ended, silence fell heavy as dust. Marion stood, smoothing her skirt. "That's enough." End quote. "No," I said. "This is enough." I unplugged the drive, slipped it into my pocket. "You can keep your house, your dinners, your lies. I'm done being part of this family." End quote. Dan looked broken. Ethan looked bored. Marion looked terrified for the first time since I'd known her. I turned to leave, my voice steady. "You all built a house of mirrors. I just broke the glass. It's an hour of it." Back in my car, rain streaking the windshield. I felt something new beneath the exhaustion clarity, the kind that hurts but heals in the same breath. I didn't know where I was headed yet. Maybe a new apartment. Maybe back to the quiet of the library stacks where things at least stayed where they belonged. But one thing was certain. I was done being their experiment. Word spreads fast when a family built on image begins to crack. Within a week, our story, my story, had become the quiet scandal of the town. Not through gossip magazines or shouting matches, but through whispers that carried at grocery store aisles and church potlucks. The twins who fooled a woman, the mother who orchestrated it, the wife who walked away with proof. But before that storm truly hit, there was the night I faced them one last time. The following day, after the family dinner fallout, I met Dan in a small cafe near the old courthouse. He had texted me twice, "Please, just 10 minutes." I agreed not for him, but for closure. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting by the window, sleeves rolled, coffee untouched. He looked smaller somehow, like a man carrying the weight of his own reflection. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I didn't come for you," I said. "I came to listen to the truth you think you still owe me. I know one." He nodded slowly, eyes flicking down. "I deserve that, if you embrace." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the rain drizzled like static, tapping against the glass. Then he began. "When Ethan started talking to you before we met, it was supposed to be a prank," he said. "Just him pretending to be me online while I was away on a job. But then he said you were different, that you made him feel seen. By the time I came back, Mom told me to just let it play out. She said if you fell for me afterward, it meant it was fate, not deception." He rubbed his temples, voice breaking. "By the time I found out how deep it went, you already loved him or thought you loved me. I thought if I told you, you'd hate all of us. I thought I could just rewrite the story." End quote. "Rewrite," I whispered. "You don't get to rewrite real people." Dan. "Inamard." "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I never laughed about it. I loved you." "It's tamadid." I took a slow breath. You can't love someone honestly after you've built the foundation on lies. You love the comfort, not the person. Byender. His eyes filled. Please don't let Ethan win. Incensed, I stood. Ethan already lost. So did you. The only person left standing is me, and I didn't need to win anything. Enter 4. It is another lawn. I left the cafe without looking back. Through the glass, I saw his head bow into his hands. For the first time, I didn't feel pity. I felt release. By Thursday, Marion's perfect facade began to crumble. The church women who used to hang on her every word suddenly avoided her pew. The building clients that once hired the twins' company quietly backed out. Someone must have leaked the footage, maybe Claire. Maybe someone at that dinner, but I didn't ask. The truth had legs now, and I was done trying to hold its leash. One evening, I stopped by the library to return a book and found 2 co-workers whispering near the shelves. When they saw me, they froze, eyes wide. I heard, one of them murmured after a moment, "June, I can't believe it. Are you okay?" End quote. I smiled faintly. Better than they are. It's reviers. They nodded awkwardly. But I wasn't angry. I understood. People need stories like this. They make them feel safe by comparison, like betrayal is something that happens to someone else, not them. A week later, Ethan showed up outside the library. He leaned against his truck, wearing sunglasses, though the sky was gray. "June," he called as I walked out. I didn't stop. "Come on, you owe me a minute. It's don't fict, it's don't free." I turned. "I don't owe you anything." End quote. He smirked. "You always did like pretending to be stronger than you are." End quote. "And you always mistook arrogance for charm. Just ox out." His grin faltered. "You think this'll fix you? Playing the victim for the whole town." End quote. "Fix me," I said softly. "No, it frees me." They don't filed and deviled. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You think you've won. But all those videos, Mom's not the only one who has copies. There's another text polity." I didn't blink. "Then use them. I'm not the one who should be ashamed." 8. For the first time, he looked uncertain. I turned and walked away, heart steady. When I glanced back through the library's glass door, he was still standing there, small against the gray sky. The following Sunday, I went to church alone. I hadn't stepped foot there since the wedding. As the choir sang, I sat in the back pew, hands folded. The minister's sermon was about truth, how it liberates before it punishes. When the service ended, I felt someone's presence beside me. Marion. She looked pale, her pearls absent, her eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "I suppose you're satisfied," she said quietly. I turned toward her. "Satisfied? No, but I am done. I'd tell just." She nodded, lips trembling. "You've destroyed this family." End quote. "No," I said. "You did. I just stopped protecting your illusion." End quote. Her hands clutched the pew. "You could have been my daughter." She taut now allotted. I said, standing. "Until you decided I was just another experiment." "Okay, that is pros tell pros placed, is no mourning for." I walked out before she could answer. Outside, the autumn air smelled sharp and clean. For the first time in months, the sky looked like something worth believing in. The fallout continued quietly but thoroughly. Dan sold the company's share to cover damages after clients withdrew. Ethan moved 2 states away. Marion stopped hosting Sunday suppers. Her house, once full of laughter and wine, now stood quiet, windows dark by 9. And me, I returned to the library full-time. The world of paper and whispers suited me. People still stared sometimes, but eventually they just nodded politely and went back to their errands. Scandal has a short memory when it's not your own. One afternoon, Claire stopped by my desk. "They're saying Marion might sell the house," she said. "Let her," I replied. "Maybe she'll finally learn what it's like to live without control." "It's not Sevenda." Claire smiled. "You're stronger than you think." Because I looked down at the open book in front of me, Jane Eyre. The chapter where Jane leaves Thornfield after learning the man she loves has lied. My fingers rested on the line that said, "I care for myself." The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. "It's not," and a decree added. I closed the book gently. "Maybe strength isn't about standing tall," I said. "Maybe it's about standing alone and still feeling whole." I'm 7. A month later, I passed Dan at the farmer's market. He looked older, quieter. We didn't speak. But when our eyes met, he gave a small nod, an acknowledgement of what we'd both survived. I nodded back. No hatred. No longing. Just two people finally telling the truth by saying nothing. That night, I went home to my small apartment above the bakery, opened the window, and let the smell of yeast and sugar fill the air. I planted a new basil on the sill. Its leaves were young, fragile, green with promise. When the wind moved through them, they whispered softly, not like an echo, but like a beginning. The public consequence wasn't fire and chaos. It was silence, the kind that follows when everyone finally stops pretending. Healing didn't arrive like sunlight. It crept in like dawn, slow, uncertain, touching only what it could before retreating. The first morning, I woke up alone in my new apartment. I thought I'd made a mistake. The air felt too still. No coffee brewing. No boots by the door. No hum of someone moving in another room. Just me and the sound of the city waking below. But then I noticed something I hadn't felt in months, quiet that didn't suffocate. I padded to the kitchen bare feet on cool tile and poured a cup of coffee from the machine I'd bought secondhand. The steam fogged the small window above the sink. Outside, a bakery delivery truck honked twice, and the smell of bread drifted up like forgiveness. For weeks, I'd measured my life in losses, a husband, a home, a family name I'd tried to make my own. But as days folded into one another, I began to realize that every loss also cleared a little more space for something real to grow. I started small. Every morning, I watered the new basil plant, whispering its name, Hope. It was a silly habit, but the ritual grounded me. Watching something fragile stretch toward the light reminded me I could, too. At work, I buried myself in the quiet rhythm of the library, shelving, stamping, cataloging. The scent of paper and dust became my therapy. I liked the order of it. Everything had a place, a label, a story that didn't change when you turned the page. Sometimes, elderly patrons lingered just to talk. One man came every Tuesday to read the obituaries aloud, saying the names softly like he was blessing them. One afternoon, he looked up and said, "You carry something heavy, miss, but you're walking straight." It still did. I smiled. "I'm learning." "It's sad." He nodded, as if that were enough. By the end of winter, I'd found small ways to feel alive again. I joined a yoga class that met in the community center basement. I went to dinner with Claire once a week, she insisted, saying my laugh was starting to come back in pieces. And sometimes, when the evenings were soft enough, I'd walk by the river with a journal in hand, writing not about what happened, but what it taught me. I learned that silence can be holy, that forgiveness is not the same as permission, and that truth, even when it destroys, is a cleaner wound than a lie that festers. Then one afternoon in early spring, I got a letter. A real one, paper. Envelope. My name, written in familiar handwriting. Dan. I held it for a long time before opening it. Inside, the letter was short. He wrote that he'd moved away, that he and Ethan hadn't spoken in months. Their mother had fallen ill, not seriously. Just time catching up, he said. He ended with, "I've stopped trying to explain it. You were right about everything. I hope someday you find peace. You deserve a version of love that doesn't come with conditions." Out of this called, I read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the drawer beside my bed. Not to keep the pain alive, but to remember what it cost me to finally be free. Months passed. Life didn't bloom overnight, but it did grow, inch by inch. On Saturdays, I started volunteering at a literacy program for women who'd left abusive relationships. They came with their own kinds of bruises, some visible, some not. One woman, younger than me, asked once, "How do you stop being angry? We're mated agrest." I told her the truth. You don't stop. You just give the anger a job to protect your boundaries, not your pain. I'm gross. She smiled faintly. Did that work for you? Down in 9. I thought of Marion's cold eyes, Ethan's smirk, Dan's trembling hands. Then I thought of the basil plant on my window, the smell of bread from the bakery, the way my own laughter no longer startled me. "Yes," I said softly, "it's working. I have an Nan." On the 1-year anniversary of the day I left that house, I drove out to the old neighborhood, not to revisit the past, but to prove to myself it no longer owned me. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The shutters were closed. The once immaculate garden had grown wild, ivy curling over the fence. A for sale sign leaned crooked in the yard. I parked across the street and just sat for a moment, watching the windows. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't need to. The silence told me enough. Before leaving, I took a deep breath and whispered, "Goodbye," and experience. The word didn't ache. It sounded like release. That night, I returned home, lit a candle, and cooked pasta the same recipe I used to make on Tuesday nights. As the basil hit the pan, the smell filled the kitchen. For a moment, memory flickered Dan's voice, the laughter, the echo of something I used to call love. Then, just as quickly, it faded, replaced by the quiet peace of my own company. I poured a glass of wine, sat by the window, and watched the city lights blink alive below. My phone buzzed. A message from Claire. "Proud of you. June. You came full circle." I smiled. Not a circle, I whispered to myself. A spiral. Because I hadn't come back to the same place, I was just higher in direct, clearer, stronger. I wish I could tell you that the pain disappeared, that I stopped waking from dreams where voices sounded too alike, or that forgiveness came easy. It didn't. But healing, I learned, isn't about erasing pain. It's about carrying it without letting it steer. Now, when I water my basil each morning, I think of the woman I used to be, the one who mistook confusion for love, silence for peace, and deception for devotion. I don't hate her. She did the best she could with the lies she was given. And when I look at the woman I am now, I see someone who survived her own unraveling and learned to weave something better from the threads. Sometimes, I still hear his voice in dreams, both of them. Actually. But in the dream, I don't flinch. I simply turn toward the sound and say, "I know who I am now. I know this verse." And that's enough. When I look back now, I don't see villains and victims. I see broken people, each holding their own kind of mirror. Some used it to reflect, others to hide. Dan wasn't evil. He was weak. And weakness, when mixed with silence, becomes cruelty without ever meaning to. Ethan wasn't a mystery. He was an echo, a man who only knew how to want what already belonged to someone else. And Marion, she was the architect. She built her family out of manipulation and control, mistaking power for love and tradition for truth. But me, I was the witness, the one who learned that sometimes the most dangerous kind of betrayal isn't from strangers, it's from the people who look at you and say family, while planning how to use your heart as proof of their own success. The truth didn't set me free all at once. It came in pieces. It came through long nights staring at the ceiling, replaying moments that no longer fit their context. It came through learning how to be okay without closure from the people who hurt me. And one day, it came through something simpler: waking up, opening the curtains, and realizing the sun still rose without their permission. People ask me sometimes if I ever forgave them. The answer is complicated. Forgiveness, to me, doesn't mean letting someone back into your life. It means no longer letting them own the story of it. I forgave because I didn't want to carry their poison in my bloodstream any longer. I forgave so I could move forward without dragging their shadows behind me. I never got another letter from Dan. I never saw Ethan again. Marion's house eventually sold, though I sometimes pass by it on the way to the farmer's market. The new owners painted the shutters white. It looks different now, brighter, almost hopeful. I like to think the house is happier, too. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear the faint buzz of a fan in my memory, that first off-key hum of a voice that wasn't quite his. It no longer hurts the way it used to. It just reminds me how powerful instinct is when we stop trying to silence it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you can survive anything if you refuse to let it turn you bitter. Pain doesn't have to make you hard. It can make you clear. And clarity, I've found, is the most peaceful revenge. When I tell this story now, people always ask the same thing: how did you stay so calm? How did you not lose your mind? Expected it. The truth is, I did. For a while. But breaking isn't the opposite of healing. It's the beginning of it. You can't rebuild until you've seen the cracks for what they are. If you've ever been lied to by someone you trusted, if you've ever discovered that love had conditions you didn't agree to, you know what it's like to stand in the ashes of something that once felt holy. You know that strange mix of heartbreak and clarity that comes after the storm. And maybe that's why I tell this now. Not to relive it, but to remind you, you're not foolish for trusting. You're human. You're not weak for walking away quietly. Sometimes silence is the loudest way to say, I deserve better. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you have stayed and fought to fix what was broken? Or would you have done what I did, walk away with nothing but your truth, and call that enough? Let me know in the comments. And if my story found you tonight, maybe that means you needed to hear this too. You don't have to prove your worth to the people who couldn't see it. You just have to live long enough to become the version of yourself they never believed you could be. Because sometimes, the quietest endings carry the loudest truth. June